Okay, so today we're tackling a word, a concept that is, well, it's kind of loaded, right? I mean, it's everywhere, dignity.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's human dignity, the basis of rights and freedoms, something we hear all the time.
Hmm.
But then it's also like, he carried himself with such dignity, or even in astrology, there's this idea of dignity.
Oh, yeah, yeah, it really does pop up in some unexpected places.
So many layers to this word.
Absolutely.
So, what we want to do today, and of course, you're right there with us, the learner,
Whoa, wait.
we're going to, really put on our philosophical thinking caps
Mm.
and ask, like, what is this thing, dignity? What does it actually mean? How are all these different meanings connected, if at all?
Yeah, are they even related?
Right. Is it moral? Is it political? Legal? What does it demand of us? How do we even show respect for it if we don't quite understand it? And where did this whole idea even come from?
Such great questions. Really gets to the heart of it.
Yeah, so to guide us, we've got a really comprehensive resource today. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on dignity.
A classic.
Yeah, and I mean, it really is. It dives deep into the philosophical approaches to human dignity, primarily within the Western tradition. So, we're not going to cover everything. That's a whole like dissertation waiting to happen.
Oh, yeah.
But what we want to do is like extract the most important insights, offer some clarity, some kind of pathway through this honestly complex idea.
A roadmap for the learner.
Exactly.
So, what I think is really fascinating about this whole topic is that today, at least in many parts of the world, we tend to think about human dignity as this inherent worth that every person possesses,
Right.
simply by being human.
Yeah, like you're born with it, it's yours, it's the basis of rights, right? We see this articulated in things like the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR.
Absolutely. But what's interesting, and what our source points out, is that this is a relatively recent development in the history of this concept.
Okay, so like what did dignity mean before it became this kind of cornerstone of human rights?
Well, before the mid-19th century, it meant something quite different, actually.
Really?
Yeah, if you were to, open up dictionaries from that time, like Hobbes's Leviathan or Samuel Johnson's dictionary, dignity primarily meant rank of elevation or conventional merit.
Oh, interesting. So more about your position in society or achievements rather than something inherent to everyone equally.
Yeah, it was tied to status, to what you'd earned or achieved, not this idea of an intrinsic worth we often associate with it today.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about how much the meaning of a word can change over time. Like this idea that all humans have an equal unearned worth just by virtue of being human that wasn't always the dominant understanding of dignity.
Right. It's a huge shift. And tracing exactly how that happened, well, it's a challenge.
Yeah, I imagine.
The source notes that historical remarks on dignity, especially in theoretical works, they're often just, brief.
Okay, so like little breadcrumbs, not the full loaf.
Exactly. So piecing together a complete picture of how this concept evolved, it takes some serious historical detective work.
Makes sense. But were there like any clues along the way, any thinkers or areas of thought where we see dignity being explored in ways that maybe, hinted at our modern understanding?
Absolutely. We do see some glimmers, for instance, legal theorists, particularly those working in the realm of jurisprudence, like the philosophy of law. They were grappling with this idea of dignity.
Interesting. So like in relation to rights and how laws are justified.
Yeah, exactly. They were exploring how dignity might be relevant to our understanding of what makes the legal system just and fair. And then there was theological inquiry,
Hmm.
especially around the idea of imago Dei.
Ah, the concept of humans being created in the image of God.
Right. So that kept alive certain notions of inherent human value, though not always directly using the term dignity in the way we understand it today.
Yeah, I see. So like these seeds were planted, but the full flowering of the modern concept was still to come.
Precisely. But of course, we can't talk about the philosophical roots of human dignity without mentioning Immanuel Kant.
Right, the big K.
His concept of Würde, often translated as dignity, is really central here. For Kant, Würde represents this distinctive and incomparable worth that sets humans apart from mere objects that have a price.
Yeah, I remember that from my philosophy classes. So like a chair has a price. But a human being has dignity. You can't buy or sell a person. You can't put a price tag on their inherent worth.
Exactly. It's that unique inherent value that Kant ties to our capacity for rational thought and moral action, the ability to make our own choices and act according to moral principles. And this, for Kant, is what demands respect and obliges us to treat each other as ends in ourselves, never merely as means.
Okay, so those are some potential threads leading to our modern concept of dignity. But as you mentioned, tracing those threads back isn't always as clear cut as we might think. Our source delves into what it calls four origin stories, these kind of commonly held assumptions about where our idea of human dignity comes from, and presents some pretty interesting challenges to each one.
Yeah, the philosophical detective work continues.
Exactly. So let's start with the first origin story. The revolutionary platitude. This is the idea that the concept of human dignity really took root during the 18th century revolutions, that those thinkers, like the ones who drafted the Declaration of Independence, were the champions of this idea.
Right, that they really put human dignity front and center. But here's the thing. The source points out that dignity is actually absent or used in a very different sense in many of those foundational documents.
Really?
Yeah. So the English Bill of Rights, it actually mentions dignity a few times, but not in the way we understand it today. It's more about the privileges associated with certain offices. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen uses it once again in the context of public officials.
Okay, interesting. But what about the Declaration of Independence? The one we all learned about in school, the one with the famous line about all men being created equal. Surely dignity makes an appearance there, right?
Nope, not a single mention.
Wow, that's really surprising. And what about the U.S. Constitution?
Same story. Dignity is absent.
Huh. So this idea that the revolutionaries were the primary source of our modern concept of human dignity, that's not quite accurate then.
It seems not. The source suggests it wasn't until much later, in documents like the Mexican Constitution of 1917 and the Weimar Constitution of 1919, that we see dignity appearing in a constitutional context with a possible moral and political meaning.
Okay, so the story is more complicated than we might assume.
And it's important to remember the learner, the powerful voices from that era, who highlighted the stark contrast between the ideals expressed in these documents and the lived realities of many.
You're talking about thinkers and activists like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, right? Those who called out the hypocrisy of proclaiming equality while denying it to entire groups of people based on race, gender, or other factors.
Exactly. They pointed out the gap between the lofty rhetoric and the systemic injustices that persisted.
Okay, so maybe the revolutionaries weren't the sole originators of our modern concept of dignity. What about the Kantian platitude, this idea that Kant, with his emphasis on rational autonomy, is the key figure?
Right, because his idea of verd, that inherent worth tied to our capacity for reason and morality, that feels very close to how we understand dignity today.
It does. And he's undoubtedly hugely influential, but the source presents some fascinating challenges to this straightforward narrative as well.
Okay, so let's hear them. What's the philosophical twist here? Well, for one thing, recent scholarship suggests that Kant might have been more indebted to the ideas of Rousseau than previously acknowledged.
Oh, interesting. So Rousseau's influence on Kant's thinking about human dignity might be more significant than we typically realize.
Potentially, yes. And there's also debate among scholars about whether Kant actually grounded respect for others on some kind of absolute inner value that he explicitly labeled dignity. Some argue that's a misreading of Kant.
Huh. So even pinpointing the exact role of dignity in Kant's own thought is more complicated than it might seem.
Right. And then there's the even broader argument that contemporary philosophers might be overestimating how much Kant directly influenced the historical development of moral respect for persons. It wasn't all just Kant, in other words.
Okay, so if not solely the revolutionaries and not solely Kant, where else should we be looking?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting to learner. Our source highlights the work of the philosopher Stephen Dorwall, who argues that the link between dignity and rights might actually originate with a thinker who wrote a century before Kant Samuel Pufendorf.
Okay, Pufendorf, tell me more.
So Pufendorf was a natural law philosopher, and he argued that humans possess fundamental rights, like the right to life and liberty, not necessarily because of some inherent quality or capacity, but because of a kind of moral standing that we naturally accord to each other as social beings.
Interesting. So it's not just about what's inside us, but about how we relate to each other in the social world.
Exactly. When we interact with someone, Pufendorf argued, we implicitly recognize them as accountable individuals who can make claims and demands on us. It's this mutual recognition of moral status that gives rise to rights.
I see. And what was that powerful quote by Pufendorf?
He said that the ultimate rebuttal to arrogance is this, and I'm quoting here, "I am not a dog, but a man as well as yourself."
Wow. So it's that recognition of a shared humanity, a shared moral standing, that cuts through any attempt to elevate oneself above others.
Okay, so we've got two origin stories debunked. Let's move on to the third one, the Imago Dei platitude. This is the idea that our concept of human dignity comes from religious thought, specifically the Renaissance and Pico della Mirandola's famous oration on the dignity of man.
Right, that idea of humans being created in the image of God, having this inherent worth and potential because of that divine connection. It's a powerful and enduring image.
Absolutely. But is it really the source of our modern understanding of human dignity?
Well, that's what this platitude claims. But our source raises some intriguing counterarguments. First of all, the title we know, Oration on the Dignity of Man, that wasn't the original title, it was given later.
Huh. So the framing itself has been shaped over time. Okay, what else?
Well, the oration itself, while famous today, it wasn't necessarily this huge influential success at the time it was written. Pico was drawing on some pretty obscure Kabbalistic ideas, and his speech was actually kind of a public relations flop. Oh, wow, a philosophical flop. That's not what I expected.
Yeah, history's full of surprises. But the most important point here is that Pico only actually used the Latin word dignitas, where we get dignity from a few times in his oration. And even then, it wasn't in a way that directly aligns with our modern understanding, especially with its Kantian emphasis on autonomy and moral worth.
So maybe Pico was talking about something different, like human potential, or a striving towards a higher state of being, rather than this inherent equal worth that we associate with dignity today.
That's a strong possibility. And the source also mentions Kant's research into the scholastic tradition, showing that while medieval Christian thinkers did discuss both dignity and the Imago Dei doctrine, these two ideas didn't necessarily come together in a way that directly led to our contemporary concept of basic human worth. It's a reminder that even when we see similar words across history, their meanings can shift and evolve in subtle but important ways.
Yeah, context is everything, right? Okay, one last origin story to tackle. The Ciceronian platitude. This is the idea that Cicero, the Roman orator and philosopher, had a kind of early understanding of dignitas that anticipated our modern sense of dignity.
Right. And on the surface, it seems plausible. The Romans did have this concept of dignitas.
And Cicero was a big proponent of human reason and virtue, right? So maybe he did have this like proto-dignity concept.
That's the idea. But once again, our source throws a philosophical wrench into the works.
Okay, hit me with it.
Well, Griffin, a scholar who has studied this closely, argues that the textual evidence for this connection is really quite thin. While the Romans certainly used dignitas, it was primarily in that earlier sense of merit or social rank that we discussed. Their ethical system tended to focus more on official duties and obligations rather than on the inherent rights of the individuals toward whom those duties were directed.
So it was more about what we owe to others, not necessarily what others can claim from us simply by virtue of their dignity.
Exactly. And Darwell further develops this critique by arguing that Cicero's understanding of human dignity was actually rooted in that ancient concept of the great chain of being. Humans were seen as superior to animals because of their capacity for reason, self-development, and virtue. But this was more of an aspirational standard to live up to, not a fundamental basis for claiming rights.
Interesting. So Cicero's dignity was about achieving a certain level of excellence through intellectual and moral pursuits, not this inherent, unearned foundation for rights we talk about today. And as we've noted, Darwell's critique really emphasizes those two key features of the modern concept: the connection to rights and the idea that dignity is something we possess inherently, not something we earn.
Precisely. So what we've learned from this whole historical journey, The Learner, is that dignity is a word with a long and winding history, and its modern meaning is a relatively recent development. Understanding these different historical shades of meaning is really important when we engage in conversations about dignity today. It helps us to be more precise and nuanced in our thinking.
Absolutely. Okay, so if there's no single clear-cut origin story, how have philosophers actually tried to define dignity? It seems like such a slippery concept, right?
Yeah, it is. It's incredibly multifaceted, and that very ambiguity is a major concern for many philosophers.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to use it as this foundational concept for human rights and morality, we need to have some idea of what it actually means, right?
Absolutely. So our source helpfully outlines 4 broad categories of meaning that have emerged throughout history.
Okay, lay them on me.
First, there's dignity as gravitas. This is about having a certain poise, a seriousness of manner.
Like carrying yourself with dignity, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, there's dignity as integrity. This is about living up to certain ethical or personal standards.
So being true to your values, acting with honor.
Right. Then there's dignity as status, which refers to your social rank or position.
So like the dignity of a king or a judge, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And finally, we have dignity as human dignity. This is the one we've been primarily talking about, the universal, unearned worth that belongs to every person simply by virtue of being human.
Okay, so those are the four big categories. But these different meanings, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? They can kind of bleed into each other, overlap, and inform each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Philosophers have really explored those nuances. For example, Cole Nye, 20th century philosopher, he argued that dignity is fundamentally descriptive. It's something that evokes both moral and aesthetic appreciation.
Oh, interesting. So like when we perceive dignity in someone, it's not just a moral judgment, but also kind of aesthetic experience.
Yeah, he connects it to the beautiful, actually.
Huh, that's pretty cool. What about other attempts to define dignity?
Well, Rosen, another philosopher, he kind of blends gravitas and integrity, and he adds another dimension, dignity as treatment.
So how we treat each other is part of dignity.
Yeah, he emphasizes that being treated with respect is essential to recognizing and upholding someone's dignity.
That makes sense.
Then there's Kateb, who makes a distinction between individual dignity and the dignity of the human species as a whole.
Oh, that's interesting. So like there's something about being human collectively that also has a kind of dignity.
Yeah, he uses the term stature for that species-level dignity. He sees it as arising from our extensive interdependence, the fact that we rely on each other for our very survival and flourishing.
That's a really thought-provoking idea, especially when we think about our collective responsibility for the planet and for each other's well-being.
It is. And then there's a more recent framework proposed by Kilmister. She outlines 3 strands of dignity.
Okay, break them down for me.
All right, so the first strand is personal dignity. This is about adhering to your own internal standards of dignified conduct.
So like your own personal code of ethics, how you hold yourself to certain standards.
Exactly. Then there's social dignity, which concerns upholding the dignitarian norms of your society.
So like following the social customs and expectations that are seen as dignified in your particular culture.
Right. And finally, there's status dignity, which arises from belonging to a category that is widely regarded with respect.
So like being a member of a certain profession or holding a certain position in society.
Yeah, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And she makes an interesting connection here. She links personal and social dignity to what she calls appraisal respect. This is similar to esteem, how we evaluate and judge each other's character and actions. But she links status dignity, including human dignity, to what she calls recognition respect.
Okay, so recognition respect is about recognizing someone's inherent worth based on their membership in a particular category, like being human.
Exactly. It's about treating them in a way that acknowledges that inherent worth, regardless of their individual achievements or social standing.
Makes sense. So like ensuring their basic rights, treating them with fairness and justice, not subjecting them to degrading treatment, those are all ways of showing recognition respect for someone's human dignity.
Exactly. Okay, so we've looked at some attempts to define dignity. But as we try to formulate a philosophical account of this concept, it's really important to distinguish between its defining properties and its grounds.
Okay, remind me, what's the difference again?
Right, so defining properties are the essential characteristics that make dignity what it is. These are things like whether it's inherent or connected to rights. The grounds of dignity are the reasons why humans possess this dignity, what it is about us that supposedly gives us this special moral status.
Okay, so it's like what is dignity itself versus what is it about humans that makes them worthy of dignity?
Precisely. And historically, the concept of autonomy, the ability to make our own choices and act according to our own reason, has been a really popular candidate for the grounds of human dignity.
Makes sense, especially given Kant's influence on this whole discussion.
Right. But in the 21st century, there's been a growing trend in philosophy to first try and articulate those defining properties, to really pin down what we mean by dignity before trying to explain where it comes from.
That seems like a very logical approach. You need to know what you're trying to explain before you try to explain its basis.
Exactly. So some philosophers, like Iglesias, they argue that universal human dignity, the kind that applies to everyone equally, must be inherent and the basis of basic rights. It's the intrinsic good of being human for him.
Okay, so for Iglesias, inherentness and grounding rights. Those are two key defining properties of human dignity.
Right. Then there's Schulzener, who takes a slightly different approach. He uses what he calls a philosophical linguistic method.
Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, he tries to distinguish between how dignity is used in different contexts. So he separates moral philosophical uses, where it's about inherent worth, from its political and legal functions.
And how does it function in those political and legal contexts?
Well, for Schulzener, it's about justifying rights based on political agreement.
Interesting. So the grounds of dignity in those contexts aren't necessarily some deep metaphysical truth about human nature, but rather the shared values and commitments of a particular political community.
Exactly. And that still aligns with the idea that a defining property of dignity in political contexts is that it can ground rights, even if the specific content of those rights might vary across different societies.
Makes sense. Any other notable attempts to define dignity?
Yeah, there's Jabes, who proposes some really interesting criteria for what he calls a satisfactory, formal account of dignity.
Okay, what are those criteria?
He says that a good account has to pick out a value that is distinctive, unearned, and incommensurable.
So distinctive meaning it sets human dignity apart from other kinds of value. Unearned meaning it's not something we have to earn or achieve. And incommensurable meaning its worth can't be measured or traded off against other things.
Right. And he adds that this distinctive value has to serve a specific function. It has to be able to tell us what has dignity and therefore deserves protection.
Okay, so it's not just an abstract philosophical concept. It has to have practical implications for how we treat each other.
Absolutely. Then there's Waldron, who focuses on a potential confusion between what he calls definitional claims, what dignity is, and practical conditions for its recognition, how we actually make it real in the world. He sees a tension between the idea of dignity as inherent and the need to establish it through social and political structures.
Interesting. So for Waldron, even if we accept that dignity is inherent, we still need to create the conditions in which it can be recognized and respected.
Precisely. And he offers a particular view of dignity that's been quite influential in legal and political thought. He sees it as a kind of elevated rank that has been extended to all humans through the concept of rights.
Okay, so like in the past, dignity was tied to social status, but now it's a kind of universal status that everyone has.
Yeah, he calls it elevated rank leveled up. And he argues that law is the natural habitat of dignity because it's through legal systems that we articulate and enforce those rights that recognize and protect our equal status.
I see. So for Waldron, it's not so much about grounding rights in some deep metaphysical concept of dignity, but rather about using the language of rights to establish and protect that equal status for all.
Exactly. And his view, while influential, it's also the subject of much debate among philosophers.
Mm.
Some argue that he doesn't really give us a clear account of what dignity is in itself, that he focuses too much on its social and political function.
Yeah, it's a bit like saying that money is just whatever we agree it is without really explaining what makes it valuable in the first place.
Right. But regardless of the specific debates around Waldron's view, there's a widespread agreement among philosophers that there's a fundamental connection between dignity and rights. And that brings us to our next big question.
Which is that connection to rights actually a defining property of dignity? It seems like it should be, given how often we see the two concepts linked together, but I guess we need to examine that assumption more closely.
Exactly. We can't just take it for granted. It's a really complex issue.
So let's dive in. What are some of the arguments for and against the idea that a connection to rights is a defining property of dignity?
Well, Fitzpatrick, who we mentioned earlier, he defines dignity as a moral status that involves inherent, unearned worth or standing.
Right, we talked about that.
And he argues that this status calls for respect and serves as the basis for fundamental rights.
Okay, so for him, that connection to rights is pretty central to what dignity is.
Right. But even within his definition, there are some interesting tensions. Like, is dignity fundamentally a status, or is it a kind of worth? And if it's inherent, how can it also be socially constructed or established through things like rights?
Yeah, those are good questions. I mean, it seems like if something is inherent, it shouldn't need to be established, right?
Right, and that's a point that some philosophers have raised against the idea of inherent dignity.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about the idea that dignity is the normative basis of rights? That's something we hear a lot, right? Like, the reason we have rights is because we have dignity.
Absolutely, it's a common claim. And it's reflected in many legal documents. But here's the thing. Those legal claims are often assertions, not necessarily fully developed philosophical arguments.
So they're saying it's true, but they're not necessarily proving it.
Exactly. And there are some strong philosophical arguments that challenge this very idea.
Oh, okay, lay them on me.
Well, some philosophers, those who are skeptical of the whole concept of dignity, They argue that none of the existing accounts of dignity can really provide a solid foundation for rights. They say it's just too vague or ambiguous.
Makes sense. If we can't even agree on what dignity is, it's hard to see how it could ground something as specific and concrete as rights.
Right. And then there's Waldron, who we talked about earlier. He argues that rights are actually articulating a kind of social status rather than being grounded by dignity.
So for him, rights are about defining our place in society, not about reflecting some inherent moral worth.
Exactly. And then there's Kilmister, who cautions against trying to derive the specific content of rights directly from the broad concept of dignity. She argues that dignity is too general of a concept to do that kind of work.
So, like, dignity won't tell us that we have rights, but it can't tell us what those specific rights should be.
That's her argument.
Yeah.
Then there's Meyer, who makes a really interesting point. He argues that even if we could explain rights in terms of dignity, that wouldn't necessarily tell us what's essential to dignity itself.
Huh. So, like, we could have a perfect theory of rights that's grounded in dignity and still not fully understand what dignity actually is.
Right. It's about recognizing that explaining one concept doesn't necessarily explain the other, even if they're closely related.
Makes sense.
And then there's Donnelly, who brings in a sociological perspective. He observes that the concept of human dignity seems to exist and function in some cultures that don't have a fully developed concept of rights.
Oh, wow. So dignity can exist without rights.
That's what he suggests. It's a reminder that these concepts, while often linked, might not be as inseparable as we assume.
Interesting.
And finally, there are some philosophers who raise concerns about the potential non-secular origins of this normative basis view, the idea that dignity is the foundation of rights.
So, like, they're worried that it's smuggling in religious assumptions about human nature.
Right. And there's also the argument that claiming dignity is inherent might actually make the link to rights less informative and even counterproductive.
How so?
Well, Valentini, one philosopher who makes this argument, she says that if dignity is inherent, then it doesn't really tell us anything about why we should have specific rights. It's just like saying, well, you have a right to X because you have dignity, and you have dignity because, well, you just do. It becomes circular and uninformative.
Yeah, I see. It doesn't give us any guidance for actually figuring out what those rights should be.
Exactly. And she argues that it can be counterproductive because it can make it seem like those rights are somehow beyond question or challenge, which can be dangerous in political contexts.
Right, because then any attempt to limit or qualify those rights can be seen as an attack on human dignity itself, which can shut down important debates about the scope and limits of rights.
Precisely. Okay, so we've seen some pretty strong philosophical pushback against the idea that dignity is the normative basis of rights. But what about that other part of Fitzpatrick's definition? The idea that dignity grounds the authority to make claims.
Right, because that's another important way that dignity and rights are often linked. It's not just about being worthy of respect, it's about having the standing to demand that respect from others.
Exactly. And this idea actually gets a fair bit of support from philosophers.
Okay, who are some of the key figures here?
Well, Feinberg, who we mentioned earlier, he made a brief but really influential remark suggesting that human dignity may simply be the recognizable capacity to assert claims.
So, like, our ability to say, hey, I have a right to this, or you can't treat me like that, that's actually part of what constitutes our dignity.
That's the idea, and this connects really well with Darwall's concept of second personal authority, which we touched on earlier.
Right, the idea that dignity arises within those reciprocal relationships where we recognize each other as having the standing to make demands and hold each other accountable.
Exactly. So it's not just about possessing some abstract inner quality. It's about being able to participate in those moral dialogues where we assert our claims and hold each other to certain standards of conduct.
Okay, so we've explored the connection between dignity and rights in quite a bit of depth. What other defining properties of dignity have philosophers proposed?
Well, our source highlights two others that are particularly interesting for us to consider: distinctiveness and fragility.
Distinctiveness and fragility. That's a really interesting pairing. What does that tell us about how we think about dignity?
Well, let's start with distinctiveness. Ettinson, a contemporary philosopher, he argues that a complete theory of dignity needs to explain not just its grounds where it comes from, but also the proper way to investigate it, the proper method of inquiry.
Okay, so like not just what dignity is, but how we should go about studying it.
Exactly. And he suggests that we can gain some really valuable insights into dignity's unique normative role, what it does for us morally and politically, by focusing on the conditions under which it is violated.
So it's fragility, in other words.
Exactly. He argues that not every moral wrong constitutes a violation of dignity.
So, like, if I accidentally step on your foot, that's wrong, but it's not necessarily a violation of your dignity.
Right. It's about recognizing that dignity has a specific kind of moral importance. It's normatively special, in his words, and we need to look at its fragility to understand what makes it so.
Makes sense. So, like, if we can figure out what kinds of harms specifically target or undermine dignity, we can get a clearer picture of what dignity itself actually is.
Exactly. And this focus on fragility, it's not just about human dignity either. Kilmister, she argues that it applies to all those different senses of dignity that we talked about earlier: gravitas, integrity, status, and human dignity.
Interesting. So, like, even someone's personal dignity, their sense of self-worth, that can be harmed or undermined, just like their human dignity can be violated through things like humiliation or degradation.
Exactly. And she actually proposes this as a kind of test for a good philosophical theory of dignity. It should be able to explain how all those different senses of dignity can be harmed or undermined.
Okay, so a unified theory of dignity.